So it's been an interesting day in India-US relations. You have the extradition of Nikhil Gupta, the prime accused in the Pannu murder for hire case, to the United States. He was, of course, arrested by the Czech Republic in June last year. You now have him in a state penitentiary, in a federal penitentiary in New York. You also have another interesting development today with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in town. He's meeting Prime Minister Narendra Modi, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, and of course his counterpart, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. So to help us understand what's going on with the Gupta case as well as its implications for India-US relations, I'm joined by Sushant Sareen, a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Mr. Sareen, could you help us understand, just this Gupta assassination saga and how since last June it's essentially impacted India-US relations, or at least since November when it hit the national and international headlines?
Shashank, as of now, it's more of a kind of an irritant in the relationship. It's one of those blips which come into a bilateral relationship, which otherwise everything seems to be going fine. Not everything actually, but mostly the relationship seems to be going all right. But this is certainly a major blip. And what is kind of curious about this entire incident is the way that the Americans and their lackeys in rest of the Western world have been trying to play it up. Unless, of course, you believe that, all these Western media organizations are completely independent organizations. They're not part of a larger kind of a foreign policy establishment of the Western countries. I don't believe in that because the way they seem to have lashed onto this one incident and built up an entire theory and then, gone to every Tom, Dick and Harry, picked up something without verifying it. They would not publish those stories about their own countries or allegations made within their own countries. Those would be listed as conspiracy theories. So there is something quite curious about the way this whole issue has been built up, almost as though it is to push India against the wall on this particular issue.
Right.
And frankly, the fact that these are supposed to be our friends, these are countries which are, in a manner of speaking, allies in a common cause, for them to be seen to have a very, very, benign attitude towards characters who indulge openly in hate speech, who openly target the Hindu community, for example, in these countries, who vandalize property, who threaten diplomats, who threaten to blow up aircraft, who threaten to assassinate the prime minister of another country, all of which Pannu has been doing, and no action is taken against him. Not even a shut-up call is given to him. It makes me extremely curious as to what exactly these countries are trying to get at. What exactly is the play out here? So something is not quite right. But if you remove this from the larger equation and the rest of the very vile propaganda which has been carried out about democratic backsliding. Now, democracy is perfectly alive and well in the US, where hundreds of people are killed in police encounters and police shootings. There is rampant racism. All of that is perfectly okay. That's not democratic backsliding. The principal opposition leader is hounded in a case of very dubious kind of a case and has been convicted in that. That is not democratic backsliding. But, that entire ecosystem comes together to label India as some kind of this great ogre which is developing in the world. And that, India might become the second China, maybe worse than China, dictatorship, Hitler. You look at all that kind of vile imagery which goes on. So, these are things which don't quite fit into the larger stuff that, we seem to be talking about. The closer cooperation, the strategic convergences with the Western world that India has, India's desire to build even closer relationships with the Western world. There is a kind of incongruity between, this stuff and the larger good stuff that we keep talking about.
Right. So you mentioned something very interesting. You called it, a blip in relations. But there's been this emergent narrative these days that actually this issue, or especially this assassinations controversy, since it's come up, has actually dampened the pace of engagement between India and the US to the point where you had the Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell come out and actually publicly have to make a statement saying that actually no, we're still very committed to this relationship. Then there were some conversations about, the G7. Why was there no meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden? But regardless, this idea that somehow things are not at the high that they were at in June 2023 when Prime Minister Modi went for his state visit. Do you think that would be acceptable to say that this has introduced some sort of tension in the relationship? Do you think it's likely to stick around for a while? How do you see it?
No, it's definitely irritant in the relationship. I don't think anybody can deny it. It's maybe a blip, maybe even more than a blip. But I think sensible people on both sides don't want this to be blown out of proportion. Don't want this to become the main issue between these countries. And Kurt Campbell is somebody who has always, wanted very close relationships with India. The Indian leadership, for their own reasons, have always wanted a much closer relationship with the United States. I think maybe there should be some rethink on that, on how do you want to get to their embrace, what exactly do they expect from you, but that's a separate argument. The bottom line is that there are enough people in India who want a very close relationship with the United States and the West. There are people in those countries which also want a similar relationship, so they will try and play this down. Right. At the same time, there are the other tensions which are also taking place, and perhaps there are lobbies within these countries which are trying to play spoilers, which is not entirely unheard of. On the issue of whether the Prime Minister met Mr. Biden on a in a separate meeting, they met plenty of time. Maybe they had nothing to talk about this time. Maybe there was nothing more to talk about. Maybe Mr. Biden was not all in the sense that there have been serious questions raised about his situational awareness, for want of a better word. Maybe it's because of that. Who knows? But I don't see that as a major issue. But I certainly think that both sides, if they don't want things to spiral out of control, need to get serious on this. And the Americans and their allies need to ensure that they put a leash on this whole Khalistani element. But that does not absolve us, of having to put a leash on these elements. Right. After all, we've also allowed them to run amok in India. Mm-hmm. We allow these Khalistanis who are openly, protesting against India, who are openly threatening people. We allow them to come into India. We allow them to attend weddings. We allow them to come for holidays out here. We allow their friends from the West to come in. We do all kinds of things. And then we keep pointing fingers at the West, who will turn around and say that, look, why don't you stop these guys from coming in? Why hasn't anybody taken any action against the glorification of terrorists by the SGPC and other groups? Right. Why is everybody just silent about it, pretending that none of this is happening in Punjab? So I think we cannot absolve ourselves of kind of brushing this whole thing under the carpet while expecting the others to act on it. But I think both sides need to get serious about this, because this is getting out of hand. For somebody who has seen what has happened in the 80s, I can tell you there are remarkable resemblances between what is happening now and what has happened in the 80s. Only this time it is much more in your face. It is much more that, these guys are running riot in the West, which wasn't an issue back then, partly because you did not have information traveling as fast as it does now. Means of communication were not the same. Travel much more difficult. Now all of that, is not there. So add that to what is happening on the streets of Punjab, and it's a very serious situation which is developing. But we seem to have, taken an ostrich-like approach. We'll dig our head in the sand and hope that nothing will happen to us. If that's the way we are going to run national security, then good luck to us.
Right. So if I could ask you a question, there seems to be some sort of disconnect, right, between, you mentioned, of course, Western media as well as Western governments. You see, on one hand, the Indian government, when it talks about the issue of Khalistan, talks about from a security lens, talks about terrorism, talks about what you alluded to, about how bad it was in India during the 80s and the 90s. Whereas it seems today, whenever coverage of this comes up in any Western newspaper, it seems to be the narrative is very much framed as transnational repression. These people are framed in some ways as activists that sort of India is trying to suppress. So there seems to be this narrative disconnect. Do you think India has, in some senses, failed to get its narrative across? Is this something more deliberate? But even if it has or it hasn't, is there a way that India can specifically go out and sort of sensitize Western publics as well as the government that, look, this is something that, is not something that just happened 40 years ago. It's a real and a live threat. As you were mentioning, there are real resemblances between what happened 40 years ago and what's happening now.
Shashank, look, at one level, there is a problem in the kind of strategic communications which is being done from India, right? Uh, and I think we have fallen back, or we are not ahead of the curve on as far as strategic communications is concerned, as far as convincing the other countries of what exactly transpired in the 80s and 90s, what kind of terrorism was there, how people were being massacred, what kind of hate was being spread by this element, etc., etc. Right? I think that's our failure, and I have no hesitation in accepting that that's been a failure of strategic communication. That is one part of it. The other part of it is what the Western media is doing. I don't think the Western media is entirely autonomous on this. Somebody is feeding them, somebody is guiding them, somebody is propping them up to carry out some of this propaganda which is being carried out. But I think the larger question needs to be asked of the Western media. If, for example, in Australia, a group was to stand up and threaten to blow up, or in the US for that matter, where people are far more paranoid because of 9/11, if somebody was to stand up and say that, okay, fine, nobody from Ireland should travel in a United airline on such and such date because otherwise your life is in danger. What do you think would happen to that guy? I'm very curious to know what would the Americans do to somebody who openly, publicly makes a threat like this. What would this do if somebody in the United States was to openly, publicly say that, okay, fine, Justin Trudeau, you watch out, we are coming for you, we are going to kill you. If somebody in the United States was to make a threat like that, what do you think they would do? If they were to attack their symbols, okay, now in the US, everything is woke these days, so you can attack anything. There's nothing sacred anymore. But for example, if somebody was to go to Arlington Cemetery, for want of a better place, and carry out vandalism out there, what do you think these guys would do? Do you think they'll just keep quiet? They'll just tat and say nothing more than that? I don't think so, right? How is it that the lives of Indians are not as important as the lives of white men or black men or whichever other color they want, right? So there are serious questions which they themselves need to ask themselves. And the moment you point this out, they'll say, oh, but did they make such a threat? Listen, if you guys are dunces and you can't understand Punjabi, call a Punjabi to translate it for you and tell you what are the kind of threats Pannu is hurling and what is the kind of audience he's trying to get. What are the kind of, they are talking about transnational repression. Let's talk about transnational criminal gangs who are running amok, not just in Canada, but on the western coast in the US, people who are part of this entire human trafficking and human smuggling networks through Mexico and other places. What about those gangs? Or is that all kosher because they serve as a vote bank for the Canadians, and since the Canadians are good buddies of the Americans, everybody should keep quiet? Again, having said that, I am not absolving my own government of turning a blind eye to what is happening in Punjab. So Punjab is finished, if you ask me. It's in a really bad place, that entire state. Right. But that's another debate. But I think the security angle has to be addressed both abroad as well as in India.
Right. If I could ask you that on that foreign question, you of course talked about, you're very frankly acknowledging that, okay, strategic communication has not been something that we've done extremely well. What would you like to see the government do better? If you were the power that be, how would you change it? In terms of, what do you think the inconsistencies, what do you think the deficiencies have been so far in terms of just getting out there and telling people that this is like a real threat? Because, you see Dr. Jaishankar go out and do it. You see, you have, of course, I'm sure in between intelligence agencies, those conversations, but it does not seem like that message is getting through. What do you think we could be doing differently?
Look, I think a lot of the communication which we have done so far is basically addressed to people in India, right? It is one thing for people.
इससे महत्वपूर्ण जो है,
absolutely.
जो वायनाड सीट पे वो
Shashank, can you hear me?
I can, yes. I can, perfectly, yes.
Yeah. So look, the problem is also because yes, Dr. Jaishankar has been batting for India. Yes, he has been speaking, but a lot of the questions which are put to him uh, are on other issues. For example, there was the Russia-Ukraine war, and he's played that out very well, explained the matter very well, and you suddenly see a lot of resonance coming from uh, these countries, that there is a greater level of understanding. That there will be carping sounds. I'm not saying there won't be, right? But you've seen that the message on our on the necessity to engage with Russia is an important thing for us for a variety of reasons, and we've been able to put that point across. Although it's mostly Dr. Jaishankar who's been batting, I think it needs to be a much more broader effort. It needs to be a much more public effort. That does not mean that you plaster, some buses with some ads to say this. No, it has to be a very carefully designed communication strategy which takes the message and which sends the message across. So yeah, job ministers should be doing it. Dr. Jaishankar certainly does it very well. But I suppose there are other officials and others who also need to be doing it.
Right.
Number one. Number two, the idiom has to be correct. It has to be an idiom which actually which strikes a chord with the other side. And very often we see that there is a lot of outrage in India over what we see as a very biased attitude, but the response is not in the idiom in which you can really push back and send your message across. So I think we need to understand what works with the audience you are trying to address. And that also has been a bit of a failure. Number three, on how we handle our own communications within the country. What is the message, for example, which has gone on within the country? We've tried to sidestep it, we've tried to downplay it. We haven't really come out openly saying that this is what our position is and everybody else can go and take a hike. There needs to be a more amount of forcefulness in the positions which we take. These need to be carefully thought out. These do not need to be knee-jerk, but they need to be done in a way that the audience which you are trying to address, you are able to reach that audience. Right. If you're talking only to Indians out here, well, it'll work among this crowd, but then this crowd is not the one which is shaping the narratives worldwide. Mm-hmm. For example, even on this whole propaganda against the Modi government, yes, there's been a lot of outrage on Twitter, on Facebook, on other social media platforms. But again, just look how that outrage has been expressed. Has that outrage been expressed in a way that you take this thing to the people who are peddling this propaganda and challenge them in a way that it actually strikes a chord, in a way that it is much more widespread? No, we haven't been able to do it. What you need is a good professional communication strategy. Mm-hmm. What you have is a very piecemeal kind of individualistic kind of an approach, which really isn't working, if you ask me.
Right. If I could ask you just one more question, just I'm sorry to pull it back on what you were saying earlier about the question of a blip, and you were also talking about, you raised some questions about the autonomy of the Western media, of course, the kinds of revelations or at least reporting that we've seen in a lot of Western media, of course, couldn't have come through without people in intelligence agencies and the State Department and so on talking to these news media organizations, just the kinds of revelations, the CIA analysis appearing in these reports. What do you think the incentive is for the U.S. government here? Because you have at least the last Washington Post report that I remember reading said that, of course, it directly implicated or at least directly pointed towards Samant Goel, the former RAW chief, as the man responsible for giving the green light to the Pannu murder for hire case, or so on and so forth. That was at least what the report said. And of course, the Washington Post may not have run that without people in the American intelligence and security establishment telling them so. So what do you think the play is here for the Americans? Because for a lot of people, as you were mentioning, we have so much that we would like to cooperate with them on. Jake Sullivan is here to talk about a whole host of things. But then you also have this, which is confusing to people, that, you're directly picking someone who is very close to Prime Minister Modi and to National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. How do you see that?
Personally, I think Mr. Samant Goel should have sued the newspaper for taking his name and for making these kind of allegations and sued them in Indian court, dragged their backsides through the Indian legal system. And I don't see any reason why he should not have done it. And I don't see any reason why the Indian legal system should not be used against these kind of allegations. But having said that, on the larger question which you put, which is what I said right at the outset, that at one level you will see enough responsible, sensible people who look in a long-term kind of a way, realize that look, India is a swing state, India is a pivotal state, and that there will be ups and downs. Of course, there will be, because no two countries are going to be the same, but there are many more convergences than there are divergences. So we need to build upon that. So there are people like that in the Western system, in the governments and others. But there are others who are very bloody-minded about it. Now, who knows what exactly is pushing them? Is it an ideological thing? Because again, we've seen in the American system, there are a lot of people with a lot of ideological baggage, leftists, wokes, all kinds of other characters, who live in a world of their own, imagine a world of their own, and would obviously not, like somebody like a Modi or any kind of a Hindu resurgence in India, which they think is something which goes against their ideological grain. So there could be those kind of elements who are leaking stuff like this. It could be coming from a much higher level to say that, okay, fine, look, the Indians are getting a bit too big for their boots. Let's pull them down a couple of pegs. And let's push them against the wall on this particular issue. And let's see how far we can take it. And so far, because there hasn't been much of a pushback from the Indian side, partly because we value the larger relationship and we don't want to make a big issue out of this. So we haven't pushed back on this. But that actually encourages the other side to keep pushing us more. Now, these are the same countries where the Pakistanis, for example, have been carrying out killings, they've been carrying out intimidation, they've been actually threatening people publicly, openly, and no action is ever taken against them, right? In the same countries, in the UK, in Australia, in the US, in Canada, in Sweden, nothing has happened to them. So, obviously, something must be happening, right? Now, if supposing there has been an incident, let us for a moment, for the sake of argument, accept that there was something which was happening. Okay? Now, the same thing could have been solved, very quietly, silently. You could have a very candid discussion, but not make it public, not try and embarrass each other. Now, out here, there's a very clear design to try and embarrass India. And give India's enemies a kind of a handle to beat us up with. And there has not been any pushback from the Indian side, not in the way that a pushback should have come. Again, when I say a pushback should come, I'm not saying that, give maa behan ki gali. I'm not saying that, right? What I'm saying is that use idiom, use the language which actually pushes back at these guys. And tells them certain messages on where they need to lay off. But look, Shashank, at the end of the day, I can come up with any theory, I can come up with anything, and I can say that, okay, fine, all this media thing is being run by the CIA director. That's as good as saying that Samant Goyal was behind something. I can name anybody, because I'm not going to be held accountable. Now, if Mr. Samant Goyal or the government of India had decided that, okay, fine, we are going to sue these guys. We want them to come with evidence that who has told you this. You can do it if you want to.
Right.
Okay, it'll be a legal case, it'll be a legal mess, but why not? If that's the road you want to travel, then let's travel that road. Why not?
So you were talking about, just the broader range of things that India and the US are cooperating on. Of course, Jake Sullivan is here. He's met the National Security Advisor. He's, of course, also, which is getting the news that he's also talking to Prime Minister Modi. He's called on Prime Minister Modi as well. Of course, quite apart from the range of things that he's obviously talking about, he obviously didn't come here just for the Gupta case. Do you think that this is also, this also may have featured in those conversations between Sullivan and Mr. Doval, or Sullivan and Prime Minister Modi?
I wouldn't be surprised if this matter has featured in the thing. They would be, of course, talking about the other more important stuff. But I'm sure the Americans would raise it because they've been making a bit of a fuss about it. And I'm sure the Indians would have answered them, but I don't know in what way we would have answered them. Are we being a little mealy-mouthed about it? That no, we formed a committee, the committee is investigating, etc., etc. Are we doing that, or are we asking them to lay off and understand that not to push this thing beyond a point? Uh, so I'm not privy to those discussions, but I would be very surprised if this issue hasn't figured in the conversations which Mr. Sullivan has had in New Delhi, especially with the NSA and maybe even the Prime Minister for all you know.
Right. If I may ask, you mentioned this very rightly that sometimes countries, whenever something like this happens, will decide to handle it in a much more sensitive manner, deal with it behind closed doors, not try to embarrass each other. But here, of course, it seems like the cat is out of the bag. There's been a massive public furore about it. How do you think people will handle it moving forward? Do you think that this will be dealt with more quietly moving forward? What would India be pushing for? Do you have a sense of that?
Look, it entirely depends. I think it will depend a lot on how the Indian side reacts to this entire thing. Uh, my own sense is, maybe call me a conspiracy theorist, call me whatever, call me a pessimist, whatever. But my own sense is that there is a very clear design to push us, into a corner and see how far we can be pushed into a corner. And so far, it seems that they'll keep pushing. Now, the government will have to decide whether it wants to brazen it out, whether it wants to ask them to go and take a hike and tell them that, sorry, we are not going to cooperate with you anymore. If this is going to be a spoiler, then so be it. Will they follow that route? I'll be surprised if they do, but I think some amount of pushback will be needed. And then maybe the Americans want to push us to a point where, we give in to some things which they're asking, and then they make this all go away. That's the way it normally happens, that, they make a big fuss of a particular issue, and then they just let it slide, it just recedes into the background. Everybody forgets about it because something else takes over, and life goes on. Probably it'll be that. But the question is, what's going to be the quid pro quo? What are they asking? What's their ask on this whole issue? Or is it just to embarrass us, bring us down a couple of pegs, put us in our place, cut us down to size? None of which is entirely unheard of as far as the Western world is concerned. That's what they do to countries. They do it to their enemies, they do it to their friends. That old saying of Henry Kissinger comes to mind often, that to be America's friend is, to be America's enemy is very dangerous, but to be America's friend is positively fatal. So that does come to mind all the time. And it's not just with the Americans, it's also with the British. They also play a very slimy game at times. And then along with them, suddenly you see the Australians getting all worked up. And what are they getting worked up for? But yeah, you've seen that. It's not at the Prime Minister's level, at the Aussie Prime Minister's level, or at the governmental level. But you suddenly see Australian straight media and others making a big fuss of it. Now, these same guys never made a fuss of it when the Khalistani element openly, display arms and threaten people and vandalize the Indian consulate or the Indian embassy, or threaten all kinds of other people, vandalize temples. That time there's no outrage. Now suddenly there's a lot of outrage. That's some transnational repression, a new term which the Americans have invented. And if you want to talk about transnational repression, then let's talk about what the Western world does around the world. I wonder how that is described. If that's not transnational repression, then what is that? Right. So it's a kind of a game which the West thinks it can continue to play and get away with. It has for the last hundreds of years. But I think they need to wake up, smell the coffee. That world is changing. It's not going to be the same world anymore. Right. Now they either want countries to be their friends, or other countries will have their own agency and will take their own decisions, which might not entirely be to the liking of the West.
Right. And I think there was a bunch of very interesting things there in this conversation, especially I think your very frank conversation about strategic communications, because at least here in the media sometimes you see that a lot, that we have been largely reacting to these stories which have been coming from the West. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation wrote a story about Indian intelligence activities in in Australia. You have the same thing with the Washington Post writing stories about Indian activities allegedly in America. It seems like the Indian media is very much on the defensive, and that on the strategic communication side, there remains a lot to be done.
I'm sorry, I just want to take half a minute of yours. Tell me something. We know it's not as though Indian intelligence is completely, sleeping on the job. For example, we know of how the Western, think tanks and others work. We know of, what kind of rackets they run in the country, what kind of people they sponsor, etc., etc. You know it all. They have a lot of information, but look at the way that information will come out. What prevents them to come to India Today Digital and ask you that, okay, fine, here is the material, make a nice, swanky, slick documentary on how the Aussie intelligence guys or the Canadians, what are the Canadians doing with 30 odd people in Chandigarh? What is the work they have in Chandigarh? What is the kind of intelligence they were doing? Were they trying to actually sow dissensions in India? Were they being the cat's paw? We don't know. But look, if you want, there is enough that you can pick up enough information and make a really nice documentary about all these guys and make it in a slick way, make it in a way that it actually drives home the message. No, but you will give it to Doordarshan or you will give it to somebody who doesn't know the art of strategic communication. What's the point? It's a waste. So I think we need to learn how to, do this in a professional manner, which we have failed to do. What do you say? It's frustrating, but that's the way it is.
On that note, I'm going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Mr. Sareen, for your time and for explaining, I think, this really defining issue in many ways, something that for at least the last 4 to 5 months has really defined the media's attention on the India-US relationship, and even in many ways turning out to be something of a worrying narrative that has taken hold about India, something that the Indian government, as Mr. Sareen pointed out, will have to do a lot more, especially on the strategic communication fronts to counter. So thank you so much for watching India Today Global. You can catch all the latest updates here on our YouTube and on